Wembley, July 30th, 1966. The whole world is watching England lift the World Cup for the first time in history. Bobby Moore raises the trophy. Geoff Hurst scores a hat-trick. Bobby Charlton weeps on the pitch. These are the names history remembers. But ask the men who were actually there, the players who sweated through every minute of that tournament, ask them who the greatest man on that pitch was. And they don't hesitate. They all point to the same person. A quiet left-back from a small mining town in Derbyshire. A man who, after it was all over, went home and opened a funeral parlour. His name was Ray Wilson. And this is his story. Ray Wilson was born in Shirebrook, Derbyshire in 1934. No football academy, no wealthy family pulling strings. Just a working-class kid from a coal mining town who happened to be able to read a football match better than almost anyone alive. He came up through Huddersfield Town, which tells you everything about the kind of player he was. Huddersfield wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a club that attracted attention or made headlines, but it was a place where you worked, where you grafted, and where you proved yourself through consistency rather than flair. That environment shaped Ray Wilson completely. By the time he moved to Everton in 1964, he was already one of the best left-backs in the country. Technically, he was ahead of his time. Most fullbacks in the 1960s were big, aggressive, and relied on physicality. Wilson was different. He was quick, disciplined, and almost surgically precise. He didn't need to rough anyone up, because he was almost never in a position where he had to. George Cohen, his fullback partner on the opposite flank throughout 1966, had a front row seat to everything Wilson did, and the phrase Cohen kept coming back to was unobtrusive excellence. Ray didn't need to be loud. He didn't need to be the loudest voice in the dressing room or the most dominant figure on the pitch. His technique spoke for him, always in the right place, almost never caught out. A man who made the extraordinarily difficult look completely routine. And that, right there, is probably why history hasn't been kinder to his name, because the things Wilson did best were invisible to the casual eye. While Hurst was scoring goals and Charlton was driving forward with that thunderous stride, Wilson was quietly dismantling wingers on the left side, cutting off angles before they even opened, shutting down attacks before they became dangerous. You only noticed him if you really knew what you were looking at. But the men who did know, the men who understood exactly what it took to play at that level, they noticed. Every single one of them. So why, decades later, when those same legends were asked about the greatest players they ever shared a pitch with, did they all come back to Ray Wilson? What did they see in him that the headlines never captured? To understand that, you have to understand the world he played in. Football in the 1960s was not a game for the faint-hearted. It was physical, it was brutal, and if you played as a fullback, you were essentially a target. Wingers back then were weapons. Fast, direct, built to run at you and make you look stupid in front of thousands of people. The standard response was to hit them early, hit them hard, and let them know you were there. Most defenders lived by that code. Ray Wilson didn't need to. Geoff Hurst, the man who scored a hat-trick in the World Cup final, said something about Wilson that has always stuck. He pointed out that Wilson was actually small for a defender. Not the imposing physical presence you might expect, but his timing, both in the air and on the ground, was so perfect that he almost never had to lunge, never had to panic, never had to make what Hurst called a desperation tackle, because Wilson was never desperate. He was always exactly where he needed to be, 2 seconds before anyone else realized that was where he needed to be. That is an extraordinarily rare quality. Most defenders react. Wilson anticipated. He read the game so well that attacks would essentially dissolve against him before they ever became dangerous. There was no scramble, no last-ditch clearance, no moment where your heart stopped. Just quiet, clean, precise defending. Gordon Banks saw it from the best possible seat, right behind him. Banks said Wilson made his job easier, which, coming from the greatest goalkeeper in English football history, is not a small thing to say. Specifically, Banks noted that Wilson was rarely beaten on the outside. He closed down space so effectively, positioned himself so intelligently, that attackers were constantly being funneled into less dangerous areas. Banks described him as a supreme athlete who never seemed to break a sweat, even against the fastest men in the world. Think about that. the fastest attackers alive, and Wilson made it look effortless. Bobby Charlton added another layer. He said Wilson's presence made everyone around him feel secure. Not just the goalkeeper, the whole team. When you know the man holding the left side is never going to be caught out, it frees you up. It gives the midfielders and attackers license to push forward, to take risks, because they trust completely that the line behind them is solid. Charlton was specific about this. He said that with Wilson on the left, he never once glanced back over his shoulder during an attacking run. That kind of trust is almost impossible to earn. Wilson had it from day one. Banks felt the same thing. He talked about how, with Wilson beside him, he could position himself for crosses and shots without worrying about runners arriving from his left. Wilson had already dealt with them, quietly, before Banks even had to think about it. That psychological effect is invisible on a team sheet. It never shows up in a stat, but any footballer who has played at a high level will tell you it is worth everything. And then there was Alan Ball, the youngest man in that entire 1966 squad, watching Wilson every single day in training. Ball later said he absorbed what real professionalism looked like just by watching Ray Wilson operate. The ability to flip from hard-nosed defender to composed, sophisticated passer in a single moment. No hesitation, no wasted movement, just complete mastery. That was the language Ray Wilson spoke, and on the pitch, it was fluent. Now, everything we've talked about so far, the technique, the reading of the game, the psychological effect on teammates, all of that existed before the summer of 1966. Wilson had been doing this for years. The men around him already knew what he was. But the World Cup is different. Home soil, a nation holding its breath. Wembley packed to the rafters with people who needed England to win more than they needed almost anything else that year. That kind of pressure doesn't reveal what you know. It reveals who you are. And Ray Wilson didn't blink. Across the tournament, England's attacking players, Hurst, Charlton, Ball, had the freedom to push forward, to press high, to take risks in the final third. That freedom didn't come from nowhere. It came from knowing that Wilson was holding the left side, that the foundation behind them was solid. Alf Ramsey built his system around trust, and the most trusted defender in that entire setup was the quiet man from Shirebrook. Then came the semi-final, Portugal and Eusebio. If you didn't grow up watching the 1960s, let me paint the picture. Eusebio was not just a good player, he was terrifying. The Black Panther, pure speed, explosive power, and the football brain that made him almost impossible to contain. He had already torn through the tournament, scoring goal after goal, leaving defenders looking helpless. He was the most dangerous attacker England would face all summer. And Ray Wilson made him look ordinary. Not through brute force, not through intimidation. Wilson simply closed the space before it opened. He tracked Eusebio's runs so early, so precisely, that the famous speed never had room to breathe. Eusebio later said it himself, nearly impossible to sprint past him. He described Wilson as a model of English defensive discipline and fair play. Not a word about being hacked or bullied or physically stopped. Wilson simply read him, anticipated him, and neutralized him. That kind of respect from a rival means something different. A teammate can admire you every day in training, but a rival only speaks your name when you've genuinely taken something from him. Eusebio spoke Wilson's name. Then came July 30th, the final. West Germany, the biggest game England had ever played. Make sure to like and subscribe. And now back to the video. George Cohen, standing on the opposite flank, had the perfect view all day. And what he saw from Wilson was exactly what the phrase unobtrusive excellence was built to describe. No panic, no desperation, no moments where the left side looked vulnerable. While the game swung back and forth, Germany equalizing, then equalizing again in normal time, Wilson was immovable. His positioning, his composure, his timing, all of it distilled into 120 minutes on the greatest stage in the sport. Geoff Hurst scored 3. His name became synonymous with that afternoon forever. But Hurst himself was clear when he looked back on it. He pointed directly at Wilson as the foundation the whole team was built on. The professional calmness, the perfect timing, the quiet certainty that the left side would never be a problem. That, Hurst said, was what made the 4-2 possible. England were world champions, and Ray Wilson, the man nobody in the stands was chanting for, had just played the greatest game of his life. Now, here is where the story shifts completely. Everything we've covered so far, the testimonials from Charlton, Banks, Hurst, Cohen, those are the voices of men who knew Wilson, men who trained alongside him, who played behind him, who watched him up close every single week. Their respect carries weight, but it comes with familiarity. They knew Ray Wilson the person, not just Ray Wilson the opponent. Pelé didn't. Pelé was Brazilian. He played in a different league, on a different continent, in a different style of football entirely. He had no reason to be generous about an English left-back. No shared dressing room, no personal bond, no loyalty to protect. When Pelé talked about the defenders who tested him most, he was speaking purely as a man who had faced the best the world had to offer, and had an honest opinion about every single one of them. And he pointed at Ray Wilson. Pelé identified Wilson as one of the toughest defenders he encountered during the 1960s. But what makes his words land so hard isn't just the praise, it's the specificity. He wasn't complimenting Wilson's physicality or his aggression. He spoke about Wilson's ability to shadow world-class wingers without ever resorting to foul play, his exceptional reading of the game, the way Wilson seemed to know where you were going before you decided yourself. Think about what that means coming from Pelé. This is a man who spent the 1960s dismantling the best defenders on the planet almost at will. If you gave him half a second and half a yard, it was over. And yet Wilson, the quiet man from Shirebrook, the kid who came up through Huddersfield, was the kind of opponent who never gave him that second, never gave him that yard, not through violence, through intelligence. He didn't need to hack. He didn't need to intimidate, he just knew. And for a player like Pelé, that was far more dangerous than any crunching tackle ever could be. Now step back and look at what we actually have here. Pelé says he was one of the toughest he ever faced. Eusebio says it was nearly impossible to sprint past him. Charlton calls him the finest defender he ever played with. Banks says he made his job easier. Hurst calls him the foundation the whole team was built on. Cohen gives us unobtrusive excellence. Ball says watching Wilson taught him what real professionalism looked like. 7 legends, 7 completely different vantage points, rivals, teammates, a goalkeeper, a striker, the youngest man in the squad, and every single one of them lands at the same place. That is not coincidence. That is not sentiment. That is the football world quietly telling you the truth about a man it never properly celebrated. The highest form of respect in this sport doesn't come from the stands. It comes from the men on the pitch who know exactly what it costs. And Ray Wilson had all of them. So what happened to the man every legend called the greatest? He went home. That's it. No television career, no autobiography, no column in a newspaper telling the world what football got wrong. Ray Wilson walked away from the game he had mastered and opened a funeral parlour in Huddersfield, quietly, without ceremony. The same town where he had first built his name, the same community he had never really left in his heart. He served that community every day, with the same steadiness and care he had brought to every single match. No fanfare, no expectation of recognition, just work, done properly, for people who needed it. And there is something deeply poignant about that image. The man Pelé respected, the man Bobby Charlton called the finest defender he ever played with, the man Gordon Banks said made his job easier. That man was spending his days helping ordinary families through the hardest moments of their lives in a small Yorkshire town with no fuss and no fanfare. It fits him actually. When you understand who Ray Wilson was, what drove him, what he valued, how he carried himself, the funeral parlour makes complete sense. He was never in it for the noise. That man was robbed of his memory. Slowly, quietly, in the same understated way he had lived his whole life. When the news became known, the response from the football world told you everything you needed to know. Former teammates, former rivals, people who had played alongside him or against him decades earlier, they all came forward. The outpouring confirmed once again what the legends had always said. This wasn't grief for a faded name. This was genuine love and respect for a man who had earned it the hard way and never once asked for it. Ray Wilson left the world in 2018. He was 83 years old. And when the tributes came, from every corner of the game, they all said the same thing. A true legend. A great man. One of the finest to ever pull on an England shirt. In a sport that rewards noise, Ray Wilson proved something rare. That silence, when it comes from complete mastery, is louder than anything else in the room. The greatest compliment in football isn't a trophy or a headline. It's when the men who truly understand the game, the rivals, the teammates, the ones who were there, point at you and say, "Him. He was the one." Ray Wilson never chased the spotlight. He never needed to, because the men who mattered most never forgot him. Send some love for Ray Wilson in the comments below. And if this story moved you, hit the like button and subscribe. There are plenty more legends waiting to be remembered.